The legendary curse of the Wendigo is said to turn you into something which suffers from severe starvation at all times, no matter how much you eat, and what you crave above all else is the flesh of humans. If you encounter a Wendigo yourself, never forget how desperate they are and how fast you can run. Enjoy these allegedly real encounters with creatures people believe to be Wendigos. And be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. Now, let's begin. Warning: the following story contains depictions of violence against pets and other animals. Something in my barn. From Vanderbeek. 7 months ago, my grandfather on my mom's side passed away. During this time, I was a senior in college and very close to graduating. Needing a place to stay and not wanting to share a house with my overbearing mother, I was able to convince my mother to sell me my grandfather's land. This was a beautiful property, about 230 acres of land, and half of it was woodlocked. The rest was field and farmland, though. Most of it was used to house animals that had long since been sold, as my grandfather's age caught up with him. As a kid, I loved the land, exploring the forest or attending to the animals. Revisiting the property shot memories of my grandpa back to the forefront of my mind. Getting the property back in working order was a difficult process, but after a couple of weeks, the old farm had become my home. Perhaps one of my favorite activities was going out on the porch at night to gaze at the stars that I could never see in the city. But the first incident happened not a week after I got the garage cleaned up. I was out on the porch watching the sunset, smoking a cigarette, when from the distant woods, I hear this ear-piercing screech. Now at this point, I'd lived there for 4 months, and I had familiarized myself with the sounds of the forest. So no, this wasn't an elk or a coyote or even a mountain lion. It was different. This screech sounded more like the combination of a moose in heat and a woman being killed. This wasn't too far out either. Normally the sounds I hear are distant and faint, but this sounded like it was just a few kilometers away. After that, I didn't feel comfortable with staying outside. The darkness of the woods no longer felt comforting, and every noise I heard put me on edge. I swore at that point I was being watched. After about a week, I got over it. I even asked my neighbors about it, but none of them had ever heard of an animal that could produce that sort of sound, at least none that live in this area. The second incident was just last month. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I needed to get a glass of water. I leaned over the counter, which gave me a good view out the window that led to my front yard and driveway. As I drank a glass of water, I noticed movement in the brush outside. I honed in on where I thought I saw the movement, and not 5 seconds later, I saw something run from the brush to behind my shed. Assuming it was a coyote, I grabbed the rifle I had in the broom closet next to my front door, and I headed out to the porch in nothing but my housecoat and slippers. The first thing I was greeted by was an offensive smell that physically burned my sinuses. It smelled like rot. Not just rot though, but also like the taste of blood, if that makes sense. I grabbed the high-powered flashlight next to my rocking chair, and I lit up my front yard. Not wanting to get dressed and go looking for a stray coyote, I instead turned the flashlight off, and I sat down on the porch. I waited to see if it would pass by again. After a while, I quickly got bored, and I took out my phone to check Facebook and otherwise just mess around. A few minutes after I took out my phone, I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eyes. From just behind my shed, which was maybe 60 yards away, I saw a small singular antler poking out from around the corner. Now, it wasn't unusual to see deer on my property, but what was weird was the size of it. From where I was standing, this deer would have to be over 9 feet tall. So this was a massive deer, especially considering the size of its rack, which was only less than 15 inches. I stood for a moment, confused by the size, until I thought about the thing that had originally brought me out here. I know that deer couldn't be what I saw, because the thing I'd seen was far too close to the ground. A moment after pondering this, I saw the deer, or at least the antler, fall to the ground, and after that, I heard something scurrying across the ground. I turned on the flashlight, and I shined it across the brush. Out from the brush came the most unnatural thing I'd ever seen. On all fours, the thing stood, eyes glowing like flame. At first, I thought it was a starving man. Its skin was so pale, each hand had 5 fingers, and its figure was deathly slim. But the thought of this being a man was quickly dismissed when I saw the massive claws and sharpened teeth, and the antlers adorning its head. Acting out of pure fear and adrenaline, I shot at the thing, but I must have missed it, as the creature was now crawling towards me at an alarming speed. I dropped my gun and my flashlight and practically threw myself through the front door before slamming it behind me and locking the deadbolt. My dog came running to the door to see what the commotion was. I pulled him away from the door, but froze when I heard the doorknob moving. I turned to see the doorknob slowly turning, and when it reached its apex, the door was suddenly jerked forward violently, luckily being caught by the deadbolt. My dog began to bark uncontrollably, the door continuously being smashed into by that thing outside. I was trying desperately to pull my dog away from the door. He's an Anatolian shepherd and weighed more than 100 pounds, so this task was a difficult one. It wasn't until we heard the ungodly screaming from behind the door that my dog backed off with his tail between his legs. That was a disturbing sight, to see my dog, a dog that big, afraid. I've seen him try to chase moose off of the property, and yet whatever was behind the door had him more afraid than an 800-pound moose. I can't say I blame him. I stayed in my room with my dog for the rest of the night, and only after daybreak did the overwhelming smell of rot finally leave my sinuses. That brings us to the third and final incident. I had told my family about the creature, but none of them believed me. I even called the cops and got fined for wasting their time. I knew it was still here because of the smell that came each night. One morning, I even woke up to find the body of a doe, its stomach split open, on my porch. Some nights I can see it, crawling out of the barn to torment me. But this particular night, it crossed a line. I woke up to find the smell was worse than ever, but the worst part was the scraping on my window. I grabbed my gun that I now kept next to my bed, and I slowly approached the window. I couldn't see much as it was an extremely foggy night, but I did see those glowing ember eyes and a pale hand trying to open the window. I took aim and fired at the thing, aiming between its eyes. I heard a scream that was so loud it made me drop my rifle again, and I covered my ears. Then I heard something tumble off my roof and hit the ground. I thought this was my chance, so I grabbed my rifle and my dog and gave chase. But I saw that thing somehow crawling away. My dog practically ripped the leash from my hand to pursue it. I'd run for maybe 30 seconds before I lost track of my dog in the fog. I scoped in my rifle and looked around before approaching my decrepit barn that I didn't have the time nor resources to repair. I saw my dog run inside. As I approached, gun raised, I heard a growl, a thump, some shuffling, a scream, and finally a crack before the darkness of the barn fell silent. I stared ahead, trying to find my dog, but not a moment later, my vision was invaded with white and red. I'd been pinned to the ground, rifle knocked out of my hand, eyes shut tight, awaiting my demise. But what I felt next wasn't pain. It was fur. There was warm liquid running down my hand. I opened my eyes and saw that I'd been pinned by my dog. Relieved, I sighed before noticing the red stains over his fur and distinct lack of breathing. I was in shock, staring at my dog, tears forming in my eyes. But my shock didn't last as I saw the thing approaching. It was at its full height, walking on 2 legs now as it slowly approached me. Quickly, I scrambled to my feet and ran towards the house. I'm not sure if the thing chased me, but I wasn't going to look and find out. I spent some time in a motel after that. I've spent a lot of time away from my home, my grandpa's home. I don't want to abandon my property, and I also want that thing to pay. It killed my dog, tossed its body at me like a rag doll. After researching this thing, it sounds an awful lot like the thing they call a Wendigo. At this point, I don't know what to do. Shooting it right between the eyes seemingly had no effect. I locked eyes with a Wendigo. Did it curse me? From Inkytheraven. I've always been an open-minded person who has believed in the supernatural and in cryptids. But this encounter made me 100% positive that there are things that live in this world that we don't understand. It happened in fall of 2010. I was 16 years old back then, living with my dad in our home in the countryside of southeastern Ohio. Our property's backyard, which was a field, actually bordered the largest state park in the state of Ohio, something I think played into this occurrence. It was around 8 p.m. when the sun had just fully set, allowing for the bright fall moon to bathe the ground in its soft glow. I was sitting down watching some crappy movie. I think it was Summer Catch or something. It was then that I felt the oddest sensation. I had this urge to approach our large glass front door, almost like I was being beckoned or called. Upon reaching the door, I looked out at the bright moonlit front yard to see a tall, milky white-skinned creature on all fours running. Then it stopped, like a predator sensing its prey. Its skin was pulled tightly against its emaciated, almost skeletal body, which was almost glowing in the moonlight. It smelled the air like a hungry wolf smelling for a rabbit, before its head snapped to the right, towards our front door. It locked eyes with me. Its eyes were a milky white, devoid of retina or pupil. And I also realized its lips and nose were absent too, gone from its pale, bald head. It felt like an hour that my pale blue eyes and its milky orbs looked into each other's souls, or whatever this thing possessed inside that might resemble a soul. After this stare down, it snapped its head back forward and sprinted off towards the field of our property. After it left my sight, I immediately backed up slowly, utterly shaken. Upon reaching the living room, my dad asked why the weird entrance. I told him what I saw in a trembling voice, which, unsurprisingly, he shot down and disbelieved my story. He said I was making it up, or that I'd just seen a coyote. I argued with him that what I saw was no creature I'd ever seen before, and that coyotes aren't hairless, pale, and white. He just rolled his eyes and said to calm down, that it was nothing, that I needed to just let it go. Later, I thought it over. I was thinking maybe he grew up on the same property, so he'd seen it too, and he just didn't want to remember it. That night, I slept with my hockey stick in my bed next to me. Or at least I tried to sleep. Alas, sleep eluded me, and I spent the next day nodding off in class, trying to shake the weird feeling that locking eyes with that thing had brought me. I began to slowly relax and pushed it to the back of my mind, only being reminded when the sun went down daily. Now, I had to let my dachshund puppy out every night. But every so often I'd look out at the dark woods of the state park in our backyard, and I swear I felt like it was staring back at me still, as if it was waiting for its chance to come closer than before, to make me sorry I ever looked it in the eyes. After graduating high school, I moved in with my mom in the city. Due to a mixture of her and I being close, and her having health issues, I wanted to help take care of her, and partly because of my father and I's strained relationship. However, I knew deep down it was also due to the fact that I could never see that thing again in the city. And well, it did work. I never did see it in the city. But one cold weekend in the winter of 2013, my best friend's mom began to date my dad, so I decided to go visit, spending the weekend at my dad's house. My dad and his girlfriend were Christmas shopping, so it was just my best friend and I at home, alone with the dogs. Of course, at a certain point, we needed to let them out to pee, so we opened the sliding back door to let them out. But immediately, we were hit with a deafening silence from outside. It was like all of nature and the nearby highway had been muted. Right away, I felt that feeling of eyes on me from the woods, and I was brought back to that night years earlier. I quickly told my friend to shut the door, that I didn't care if the dog just peed inside this time, though it would get me a tongue lashing from my dad. But so be it. I had to do something to escape this thing's sight, to get away from it. I didn't want it getting closer to me. I didn't want it smelling me. Now comes the part that has, as of the last few months, bothered me. It made me feel as if that night in 2010 left me cursed. Over the years after that event, I've been in 2 car accidents. I've also nearly died of appendicitis. I've had the worst string of bad luck. I went through a period of time where I nearly killed myself from depression, along with other straight-up horrible instances where I've just felt cursed. Even recently, I've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which is a painful and life-hindering nerve and muscle disease that has forced me to have to go on disability, along with my worsening anxiety issues. I came to the conclusion that I was cursed, and realized that what I saw may have been a Wendigo. The idea came to me this past spring when I watched a show called In Search of Monsters, which had an episode on the Wendigo. It was described to not only have the traditional accounts of being tall with a deer's skull, but as a tall, pale humanoid with no nose or lips, paired with milky white eyes. This, of course, caused me to have a full-blown panic attack. I actually shook as I realized I had locked eyes with this voracious and terrifying beast. This led me to begin to read about and study the Wendigo. My research has both led me to feel terrible for the poor souls that must suffer the fate of being one, but also to be in a fear-induced awe of their ferocity and power. I believe when I locked eyes with that Wendigo over 11 years ago, it didn't do its often reported possession, which might have made me into the next Wendigo. No, instead it cursed me to have all the misfortunes, personal pain, and discord in my life. The Wendigo, from Anonymous. I live in a small Vermont town. I was 12 at the time. Though it's been over a decade, I remember this like it happened yesterday. It was early spring, and we had just withstood an exceptionally harsh winter. I was a troubled kid who ran away often. In the middle of the night one night, at 3 a.m., I was on my way out the door. I turned around, and up the hill standing in the road under the street lamp was what I thought at first was a severely deformed deer. I quickly realized it wasn't when it stood on 2 legs and began to sniff the air. From my estimate, it must have been a little over 7 feet tall. Its antlers were growing out of what seemed to be a human head with a protruding jaw. It was so oddly proportioned. Its ribs were exposed, it had lengthy claws and hooved feet. It turned its head towards me and began running on all 4s. I had never seen anything run that fast in my life. As it got closer, I could make out better details of its face. Its lips were gone or non-existent. Its skin looked frostbitten, and its eyes were black. I ran inside, shutting the storm door. The closer it got, the more it drooled, too. I shut the front door then, and suddenly I heard something hit the storm door. Then something unexpected and terrifying happened. A distorted voice came from the porch. That thing out there, it was mimicking a woman's voice. It was saying, "Let me in." I screamed and ran to my mother's room. I startled her awake. Together, the two of us went back to the door to investigate. There was no one outside, but the proof remained. That monster had hit the storm door so hard it was severely dented. I couldn't speak for over an hour. I was so scared. But once I was able to, I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd really seen. She still believes the creature responsible was a mother black bear who was defending her cubs. But my story doesn't end there. I overheard my burly neighbor quietly ranting at a man about a creature who had chased him to his car. I asked him about it, but he lied to me. I told him about what I'd seen, and he and his friend were now dumbfounded. They asked me if they could see the door, and I obliged. They drove past my house, and the man turned to my neighbor and nodded. The following day, at dusk, 5 men pulled up in a truck. I went over and talked to the man who had been conversing with my neighbor the day before. "What are you doing?" I asked him. Hunting," he replied. "You're gonna go kill that thing, aren't you?" "Yeah." "Well, what is it?" I continued to question. "Kid, you should go back to your house," he said sternly. "Not until you tell me." "You ever heard the story of the Wendigo?" "Now go back home," he hissed. They walked into the woods across from my house. Later that night, only 2 men walked out. I walked out onto my porch, and I began to ask where the man I'd talked to was. But they shouted at me to go back inside. They got back in the truck and sped away. The next morning, I entered the dining room and saw a paper sitting on the table. The 3 men who didn't come back were on the front page. It said they were killed in a car accident. But I didn't think that was the truth. Needless to say, I don't go out after dark anymore. The Beast of Red Lake Reservation, from Dredo 49. I'm a 23-year-old Chippewa Native American from the Red Lake Indian Reservation in Minnesota. My people don't usually speak of this. They believe that if you speak of it, or even say its name, it will hear you, and it will only be drawn closer to you. But I'm willing to take my chances and tell you the first time I saw the Wendigo. I was about 14 years old at the time. I was told about the story of the hunter that got lost in a terrible blizzard and was forced to partake in human flesh. The spirit of the Wendigo was born, looking for its next victim to possess. I was young and dumb, so I didn't really believe the story. Not too long after, I went out with my friends. Let's call them Ben and Kevin. We just sat outside for an hour and we had nothing to do. We decided to go to the place where we can go look for some cool-looking stones. Nobody ever goes swimming in this part of the lake either. We got ready to head out. We were going to bring our bikes, but ended up just walking. It was only a half-mile away after all. My friends brought their dog along too. His name was Poppy. As we began to walk, my friend asked, "Hey Kevin, did you bring a cigarette?" Which he did. But he only had one, so we had to do 3 drags and pass. As we finished our cigarette, we were almost there. But I felt off. It felt as if we weren't alone, and I wasn't sure why. I thought I was just paranoid. As we got there, we began skipping rocks for a while and hanging out. We even found a few arrowheads that were still intact. Ben and Kevin began arguing about something. I didn't really hear what they were arguing about. Probably not important. Fast forward about an hour later. By then, it was about sunset. so we decided to head back home. As we get to the fork in the road, we all hear this loud, blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a man and an elk screaming in unison. As the scream continued, we saw this big buck run by, followed by something. Whatever it was about 9 feet tall, extremely pale. It stopped to look at us too. It let out that same scream we had just heard. That was our cue to get out of there. We get back to my house and tell my parents about what happened. They didn't believe us. However, when my grandmother heard about our tale, she called us to talk. She said, "I believe you saw the beast that roams these woods, a demon we call the Wendigo. You were lucky enough to be alive and tell the tale." From that day on, I keep my guard up. I think that deer saved us from it, remaining its target, its prey, instead of having its attention focused on us. If that deer wasn't there, at least one of us might not be here. Wendigo on my farm. From Anonymous. I was 30 when this encounter happened. I live on a farm in western Wyoming. I grew up in this home with my parents and my 2 older sisters. When we became adults, my 2 sisters moved out and got married, but I stayed home with my parents, knowing that my father needed help around the farm. A few months later, my mother had died of cancer, and my father died of a heart attack. It came down to me and my sisters after attending their funerals, but I promised my dad if he passed away, I would take his responsibilities and care for the farm. 2 years after their passing, I moved on, and that's when the encounters began to happen. I was up one morning doing the chores around the farm, feeding the cows, pigs, and chickens. While I was giving water to the cows, I caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the woods. I didn't know what it was. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but I shrugged it off, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. Later that day, it was getting late, and I was finishing up locking up the cows and pigs in the farm. But I then heard a tree branch snap in the distance. I thought it might have been a bear, since they are common here, and that branch sounded thick, and whatever broke it would need strength or weight to it. So I double-checked that the barn door was locked. When that was done, I locked up the chickens in the coop and went inside to eat something. The following day, after finishing breakfast, I went out only to find that the barn door had been slammed in. I ran inside, seeing that all the cows and pigs had been slaughtered and partially eaten. There were even 4 long claw marks on one of the cows. I assumed that in fact a grizzly bear had gotten in, but I don't understand why a bear would be hungry enough to kill and eat 4 cows and 6 pigs. It didn't stay in my head long since I cleaned up the carcasses. After all, I had a lot to worry about on the farm. I decided to keep the chickens in the basement, so as to keep whatever killed those animals away from the chickens. When that was done, I was thinking about what attacked them, and I remembered the figure I saw the previous day. Maybe these 2 things were the same animal. A few hours after going to bed that night, I was awakened to a sound at my window. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the sound continued 2 or 3 times over. Then they stopped. Still curious, I looked outside. I froze. What I saw outside my window was no ordinary animal. I thought it was a man at first, but the skin was almost rotten, and it looked like it had not eaten for years from the look of it. It also almost looked like it had chewed off its own gums. When I saw its feet, I only found deer hooves. Its arms were long and thin, ending in claws. I could see its rib cage through its upper body, and the head, I swear, looked like a flat-out deer skull with antlers on top, but its mouth had human-like teeth. The moonlight made its eyes appear to be glowing. I was petrified. Suddenly, the creature looked up, and I almost screamed. It stared at me for a while, but then it walked away. After it disappeared into the woods, I ran back to my bed and hid under the covers until the sun came up, come morning, I somehow had the courage to go after this thing for what it did. I felt as if it was either me and my farm, or that thing. I brought with me a loaded shotgun, as well as a flashlight. Then I made my way into the woods, where I saw it walk off. In the forest, every little sound made me feel paranoid. A while later, I heard something I hope I never hear again in those woods. Silence so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. Every natural sound had disappeared. But then, out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like a child crying. They sounded to be maybe 5 or 6 years old. Slowly, I made my way in the direction of the noise. But then the noise stopped. I heard something else that chilled me to the bone. My own mother, my mom who had long since passed, calling out for help. When I heard her voice, I cried. I wanted to make my way to her, but then I heard something behind me. This wasn't my mother. It had been the source of my mother's voice, but no, it was the very same creature, imitating her voice. It stood on 2 legs, towering over me. It was easily 8 feet tall. I snapped out of it and began to shoot at it. I heard a screech of pain, like a demonic elk crying out. As I reloaded, the creature turned around, but before it ran away, it gave me one last look. It ran off then. I ran back to my house, locking myself in, thinking about what happened. By the time it was getting dark, I had no intention of going to sleep, afraid the beast would come back. I couldn't be sure if I had killed it, or if it decided to stop bothering me, but it never did come back, thankfully. When I was able to afford it, I bought new cows and pigs, and I repaired the farm door. I even invested in stronger locks. I believe what I encountered was a Wendigo. The only other people I've told this story to are my 2 sisters, who surprisingly believed me. They told me when they were teenagers, they saw this dark figure with eyes that seemed to glow. I pray that none of us have to ever see it again. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.